Imagine you're a pilot, flying over the vast, empty Pacific. Your mission is simple. Fly further than any enemy thinks is possible, and deliver a bomb that can sink a battleship. Your aircraft is a masterpiece of engineering, a long, sleek machine built for one thing: range. But then you see the enemy fighters, and you know with absolute certainty that you are already dead. Not because they're better shots, but because your own plane was designed to burn. Before we get into this, honestly, pretty dark story, go ahead and get comfortable. Grab a drink, maybe turn the lights down a little, because what you're about to hear, it changes how you see the entire Pacific War. This isn't just about metal and fuel. It's about a conscious, calculated decision that cost thousands of young men their lives. So settle in, because we're diving deep into one of the most devastating and controversial aircraft ever built. And if you find these stories of forgotten history as fascinating as I do, well, you're in the right place. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. So, let's set the stage. It's the late 1930s. The Empire of Japan has a problem, a geographical problem. Look at a map of the Pacific. It's enormous. We're talking about the largest ocean on Earth, covering more than 60 million square miles. And Japanese military planners, sitting in offices in Tokyo, they knew that any future war would be fought across these thousands of miles of empty ocean, from their home islands to the resource-rich lands of Southeast Asia, like the Dutch East Indies with their oil, to the American bases in the Philippines and even Hawaii. The distances are staggering, almost unimaginable for the technology of the time. Their current bombers, like the G4M Nell, were good, but they just couldn't cut it for the kind of empire-wide war they envisioned. They didn't have the legs for it. So the Japanese Navy went to their best aircraft designers, the team at Mitsubishi, and they gave them a set of requirements. And these requirements, they weren't just ambitious, they were borderline insane for the time. We're talking about a bomber that could fly over 2,500 miles, fully loaded with either a single 800-kilogram torpedo or an equivalent weight in bombs. That's like flying from New York to Los Angeles with a 1-ton weapon under your belly. No other country in the world had a bomber that could do that. Not the Americans with their early B-17s, not the British, not the Germans. Nobody. This was to be a strategic weapon, a force projector that could dominate the Pacific. This was the absolute non-negotiable priority: range, the ability to project power across an ocean. The man in charge of making this miracle happen was a brilliant, pragmatic engineer named Kiro Honjo. And he looked at these numbers, he ran the calculations over and over, and he came to a terrifying conclusion. With the piston engines and aluminum alloys available in the late 1930s, it was simply impossible to meet these specs using conventional design philosophy. To build a plane that could fly that far with that much weight, something major had to give. A fundamental compromise had to be made. You see, weight is the eternal, brutal enemy of an aircraft designer. Every single kilogram matters. It's a constant tug of war. If you add weight here, you have to take away fuel there, and your range drops. If you add more fuel to compensate, the plane gets heavier, and you need more powerful engines, which are heavier themselves. It's a brutal, vicious cycle with no easy way out. So Honjo and his team started looking at the plane, piece by piece, system by system, asking one brutally simple question: what can we live without? What is absolutely essential for the mission, and what is merely desirable for the crew? And their gaze, inevitably, fell on the one thing every other nation, particularly the Americans and British, considered sacred: the survival of the crew. Think about an American bomber, like the B-17 Flying Fortress. It's right there in the name, Fortress. It was designed to fight its way in and fight its way out. It had thick armor plating behind the pilot's seat, around the vital components. It had self-sealing fuel tanks. These are special tanks lined with a layered rubber compound that swells up when it's punctured by a bullet, plugging the hole and preventing fuel from spraying everywhere. It had heavy, power-operated gun turrets that could put up a wall of lead against attacking fighters. All of this stuff weighs a ton, literally. It added thousands of pounds to the aircraft's empty weight. So the Mitsubishi team made their choice. They would build their miracle bomber, but it would be a ghost, a lightweight phantom, built for performance above all else. They stripped it all away. The armor plating that could stop a .50 caliber bullet or a piece of shrapnel from tearing through the cockpit and eviscerating the pilots, gone. The self-sealing fuel tanks that could prevent a simple fuel leak from becoming an unstoppable inferno, gone. In their place, they put simple, thin, riveted aluminum tanks, no thicker than a few millimeters. If a single 7.7 millimeter bullet, even a stray piece of flak, hit them, they would just pour highly flammable aviation fuel into the airframe. And the defensive guns? They were kept light and manually operated, not big, heavy, power-operated turrets that added complexity and weight. Every one of these decisions, every single one, shaved off precious kilograms. And that saved weight was instantly converted into one thing: more fuel. The math was cold, and it was simple, and it was horrifying. The weight they saved by leaving out the self-sealing tanks and crew armor alone was over 1,000 pounds, maybe 1,500. That's 1,500 pounds of extra gasoline. That's hundreds of extra miles of range. That was the difference between reaching the target and turning back halfway. The plane they created was the Mitsubishi G4M. The Allies would later give it the codename Betty. And when it first appeared in the skies, it was a monster. It was fast for a bomber. It could fly breathtakingly high, out of reach of many early anti-aircraft guns. And its range was nothing short of magical, a feat of engineering that stunned Western observers. And in the early chaotic days of the war, it was devastatingly effective. Remember that attack on the American airfields in the Philippines, at Clark Field just hours after Pearl Harbor? That was the Betty. They flew from faraway bases on Formosa, caught the American planes lined up nicely on the ground completely by surprise, and wiped out the bulk of the American Air Force in the region in a single, crushing blow. The Betty crews returned to base as heroes. Then just 2 days later, a formation of Betty bombers did something that sent shockwaves through every naval command in the world, from London to Washington. They found a British naval force, Force Z, which included the mighty modern battleship, the HMS Prince of Wales, the very ship that had helped sink the Bismarck, and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. These were two of the most powerful ships afloat, protected by a screen of destroyers, their own anti-aircraft guns, and they were supposed to have a combat air patrol, but circumstances left them exposed. The Betty bombers didn't care. They flew in, and in a perfectly coordinated textbook attack, they descended and launched their Type 91 aerial torpedoes. The Prince of Wales was hit. A torpedo wrecked its propeller shafts and flooded the engineering spaces. Then it was hit again and again. The Repulse, for a time, skillfully dodged the attacks, but it was eventually slammed by multiple torpedoes on both sides. In less than 2 hours, both of these legendary ships were at the bottom of the South China Sea. It was the first time in history that capital ships, actively defending themselves and maneuvering at sea, had been sunk solely by air power. The world was stunned. The battleship was suddenly terrifyingly vulnerable. The Betty was a hero. It was the ultimate strategic weapon. It had a range no one could match. It had proven it could sink the mightiest of warships. The Japanese High Command was ecstatic. Their gamble, this philosophy of sacrificing protection for performance, had paid off in the most spectacular way imaginable. But there was a problem. A fatal flaw built into the very soul of the aircraft, a ticking time bomb. And the men who flew it, they were starting to whisper among themselves. They had a nickname for it, a nickname they didn't share with their commanders. They called it the Type 1 lighter, because, in their grim humor, it lit up just with one hit. You see, the early victories had happened because the Betty bombers faced little to no fighter opposition. They achieved total surprise. They attacked from altitudes where anti-aircraft guns were ineffective. They were untouchable phantoms. But war doesn't stand still. The Americans were reeling, but they were learning, adapting, and building, and they were coming. And when they arrived, they would expose the Betty's secret with devastating consequences. The turning point, the moment the myth of the Betty's invincibility was shattered forever, was a hot, humid, bloody island in the Solomon Islands called Guadalcanal. By August of 1942, the Americans had captured a half-built Japanese airstrip in a daring amphibious assault and renamed it Henderson Field. It was a muddy, desperate, disease-ridden little patch of ground, but it was an aircraft carrier that the Japanese couldn't sink. And from this beleaguered outpost, a new generation of American fighter pilots, hardened by the early defeats, would take to the skies. They flew rugged, powerful planes like the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, and later the legendary chance-fought F-4U Corsair, a plane with a distinctive inverted gull wing and a brutal kill rate. And these pilots, veterans of Coral Sea and Midway, they quickly discovered something strange, almost unbelievable, when they engaged the Betty bombers. The Bettys would explode. Not just catch fire, not just trail smoke and slowly go down, but violently, spectacularly explode. It was a sight that never failed to shock new pilots. Sometimes it only took a few short bursts from their .50 caliber machine guns. A pilot would line up a Betty, fire a 2-second burst into the wing root, and the entire aircraft would just vanish, replaced by a massive orange and black fireball. Pieces of wing and fuselage would cartwheel away from the cloud. There were rarely any parachutes. It was so common, so predictable, that the American pilots gave the Betty a new, grim set of nicknames that spread through the squadrons like wildfire: the Flying Cigar, the Flying Zippo. One veteran pilot later said in an interview, it was like shooting at a gasoline tank that just happened to have wings. You'd see a flash and then nothing. It was almost too easy. The reason was, of course, those unprotected fuel tanks. A single bullet, sometimes even a large piece of shrapnel from a near miss by anti-aircraft fire, would pierce the thin aluminum skin. High-octane aviation fuel, under pressure, would instantly pour out, atomizing into a fine, highly flammable mist that filled the wing cavities and parts of the fuselage. All it took was a single spark from the engine exhaust, a hot piece of metal, or the incendiary tip of a tracer round, and that was it. The fuel vapor would ignite in a split second, and then the entire tank would detonate, and then the next one, and then the whole wing would separate from the aircraft. The fire would rush through the plane, consuming everything and everyone in its path in seconds. There was no crippled but made it home. There was no wounded bird limping back to base. For a Betty bomber, there were only two states of existence: untouched or dead. It was a binary outcome, and the odds were stacked horrifically against the crews. The statistics from the Guadalcanal campaign are just horrifying. They read like a ledger of doom. On a single day, August 8, 1942, a force of 23 Betty bombers from the elite 4th Air Group flew from their advanced base at Repulse to attack the American transport ships unloading at Guadalcanal. They were intercepted by a swarm of Marine and Navy fighters. What followed wasn't the dogfight, it was a massacre. Of those 23 bombers, 18 were shot down in a matter of minutes. That's a 78% loss rate in a single mission. Let that sink in. You're part of a squadron, you take off with all your friends, you've trained together for months, and by the end of the afternoon, almost 4 out of every 5 men you had breakfast with are dead, consumed in fireballs over the waters the Americans would soon call Iron Bottom Sound. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a systematic slaughter. The very thing that made the Betty brilliant, its long range, now worked against it. To fly from Rabaul to Guadalcanal was a 600-mile trip one way. That meant long, predictable, straight-line flight paths that American radar and coast watchers could easily track. And its lack of protection meant that every successful interception was almost guaranteed to be a death sentence for the entire crew. The American military intelligence teams back in Hawaii and Washington knew something was fundamentally wrong with the Betty's design. They had heard the pilots' after-action reports. They saw the astronomical loss rates in their summaries. But they couldn't quite believe it. It defied logic. No country would consciously build a bomber, the backbone of their land-based air power, with such a glaring, fatal vulnerability. They thought it had to be a mistake or a flaw in a specific early model, or perhaps a problem with the quality of Japanese fuel. They needed physical proof. They needed to get their hands on an intact, flyable Betty and tear it apart, bolt by bolt. That moment of truth finally came in early 1945 at Clark Field in the Philippines, the very same field the Bettys had devastated in 1941. American forces had retaken the base, and during the mop-up operations, they found something incredible. A Mitsubishi Betty bomber, tail number 76312, abandoned by its crew in near-perfect condition. It wasn't shot down, it was just left there, perhaps due to a lack of fuel or spare parts during the chaotic Japanese retreat. For the technical air intelligence officers, it was like finding the Holy Grail. They swarmed over it like ants. They took hundreds of pictures from every angle. They measured every surface. And then, with cutting torches and tools, they carefully opened up the wings to look inside at the fuel tank bays. What they saw stunned them into silence. The pilot's stories, the wild tales from Guadalcanal, were all true. In fact, the reality was even starker than the stories. There were no self-sealing liners, no rubber compounds, no inert gas systems to fill the empty space in the tanks with non-flammable gas, no armor plating around the tanks themselves, just paper-thin, riveted aluminum tanks holding thousands of liters of volatile fuel, completely exposed to any and all enemy fire. It was a design choice so alien, so ruthlessly pragmatic, that it was almost impossible for the Western military mind to comprehend. This wasn't an oversight, it was a core design feature. One of the intelligence officers on site later wrote in his private diary that it was the moment they truly, deeply understood the enemy they were fighting. It was a philosophy of war where the mission, the objective, was absolutely everything. And the lives of the men carrying out that mission were just a variable in the cold mathematical equation of war. A variable that could be set to zero if it meant achieving a strategic advantage. Back in Japan, the High Command knew they had a catastrophic problem on their hands. The loss reports from the front lines were impossible to ignore. They were losing trained, veteran air crews at a rate they could never hope to replace. You can build a new airplane in a factory in a few weeks, but you cannot build a seasoned pilot, navigator, or bombardier in anything less than years. They were bleeding themselves white. So they tried to fix it. Engineers at Mitsubishi were ordered to come up with modifications. Later models of the Betty, introduced in 1943 and 1944, finally added some crude rubber lining to the tanks, not true self-sealing, but a leak-slowing measure, and even a little bit of armor plate around the pilot's seat. But it was a classic case of too little, too late. The added weight, even these modest amounts, killed the Betty's greatest and defining asset, its phenomenal range. The new models were slower, shorter-legged, and by that time, American air superiority, both in terms of pilot quality and aircraft technology, was so overwhelming that even a protected Betty didn't stand much of a chance against a Hellcat or a Corsair piloted by a combat veteran. The ultimate, tragic irony of the Betty's design came in the final, desperate year of the war. As Japan's situation grew more dire, they began using the Betty as the launch platform for their most extreme and desperate weapon, the MXY-7 Oka, or Cherry Blossom. The Oka was a rocket-powered, human-piloted suicide bomb, essentially a manned missile with massive explosives in its nose. They would sling this flying bomb under the belly of a Betty, and the plan was to fly the cumbersome combination close to an American fleet, release the Oka, and its pilot would ignite the rockets and dive at incredible speed into a ship. But just think about the sheer, devastating logic of this. You're taking the most vulnerable bomber in the sky, the flying Zippo, and you're making it even slower, heavier, and more cumbersome by hanging a huge, unaerodynamic bomb underneath it. It was a sitting duck. American fighter pilots, who already feared the kamikaze attacks, quickly realized that the most effective way to stop the Oka was not to wait for it to be launched, but to simply shoot down the Betty mothership long before it ever got close enough to the fleet to release its weapon. In one infamous engagement on March 21, 1945, a large formation of Betty bombers, each carrying an Oka, was detected by radar long before it reached the American fleet off Okinawa. A horde of F-6F Hellcats from the aircraft carrier Hornet was scrambled to intercept. What followed was another one-sided massacre. The overloaded, sluggish Bettys were torn to pieces. Not a single Betty in the formation survived long enough to launch its Oka. They were all shot down, plunging into the sea, taking the suicide pilots with them. These young men who had mentally prepared themselves for a fiery death crashing into an enemy ship died without ever getting a chance to fulfill their mission. They were victims of the very vulnerability their launch platform was famous for. So what's the final legacy of the Mitsubishi Betty? It's a story of a brilliant, flawed, and profoundly tragic machine. It was a weapon born from a specific, logical, and even understandable need. The desperate need for range in the world's largest theater of war. But it was built on a set of cultural and strategic assumptions that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. They assumed the war would be short and decisive. They assumed they would always have the element of surprise and air superiority. They assumed enemy fighters would never be numerous or capable enough to pose a consistent, lethal threat. When those assumptions crumbled in the face of American industrial might and resilience, the Betty was exposed for what it was, not a failure of engineering, but a failure of philosophy. The Americans and British built their bombers, with all their weight penalties, with the explicit goal of bringing their highly trained crews home to fight another day. The Japanese built the Betty to reach its target, no matter the human cost. In the end, the nation that valued the lives of its airmen built an air force that could sustain itself, learn, and improve through a long, brutal war of attrition. The nation that viewed its airmen as expendable eventually and inevitably ran out of skilled, experienced crews to fly its planes, no matter how many they produced. The final, poignant, and deeply symbolic chapter of the Betty story came in August 1945, after Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. Two specially prepared Betty bombers were painted a pure, gleaming white, with large green crosses on their wings and fuselages, the international symbol of neutrality. Their defensive guns were removed, their bomb bays were empty. Their mission? To fly the Japanese surrender delegation from Japan to Ishima, where they would then transfer to an American C-54 to be taken to Manila to formalize the surrender terms. The aircraft that had ushered in the war for Japan with fire and destruction over Clark Field in 1941 was now ushering it out, transformed into a symbol of peace and submission. The circle was closed. The flying Coffin, an aircraft designed for death, had carried its last crew on a mission to end the very war it had helped to start. It was a silent, powerful admission of defeat, and a final, haunting testament to the thousands of men who had perished within its fragile aluminum skin. The choices made in war, from the drawing board to the battlefield, shape everything. If this kind of deep dive into military history is your thing, there's plenty more where this came from. Matter of fact, I've got a video about the machine gun that broke more than just enemy lines. You can check that out next by clicking up here, and I'll catch you over there.